Fire debt is worse than drought because it creates drought even when there isn't one. If you allow for double the amount of plants in the landscape, you just cut your water supply in half. And after depriving the forest of fire for over 100 years, do you think we only have double the amount of plants? Wildfire is the natural cure for overgrowth and the degradation of the forest's health. Most of the time, when you burn the forest, you don't get total consumption like you did on the lake fire, and the robust trees are largely spared. The litter is removed and the water and nutrient competition is gone, leaving more resources for the stuff that we like redwoods. The more frequently fire is introduced into the landscape, the healthier the trees become. The longer the fire debt, the more the forest dies. The rat's nest grows, the more biomass builds on the forest floor, and the risk of a devastating crown fire grows exponentially every year that fire is deprived from the landscape. In 1938, the godfather of sustainable forestry in California, Clinton Walker, penned a letter that read, "The general condition of the forests when the white man first came in California was very excellent. Then came the foresters from Yale University and put the tourniquet on the forests. I would prefer to remove the tourniquet in our timber matters, which is the lack of fire." So why do we have 2,000-year-old trees in the first place? Because Indians burned this forest every year for thousands of years. It was the introduction of more fire that made these redwoods the giants that they are, and it's fire suppression that brought them down.
We'll do it live. Okay. No. We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live. And things suck.
Welcome. Good evening, everybody. The Garnet Fire is now a big fire experiment. It is a living fire lab, and it may solve the wildfire crisis in California after all. The LA Times is actually doing journalism. What is happening? And there's a fire up in NorCal that nobody's talking about. Why not? Should we be talking about it? We'll find out. Now, in that opening sequence, there's a few things to note, right? We've got the issue of overgrowth in the forest and the role that it plays in not just wildfire, but the overall health of the forest. In addition to that, we have some folks from a long time ago who seem to understand how all this stuff works in a way that defies all of our modern sciencey stuff, right? And what's interesting about that letter that Clinton Walker wrote in regards to the lack of fire in the California forests, he talked about how all the foresters from Yale University came in. There's something about that line that I just love so much. There is something about academia where we tend to get the worst, most misguided principles that invade the real world. And the main issue that we have here is when it comes to academia, there's no real world consequences for any of their, sand table drills that they do with their academic thought exercises. They can just sort of have a theory about forestry, and there's no real consequences. Compare that with a fire chief or a superintendent, right? They make a tactical decision and it doesn't pan out the way they thought it would. People can die, and they often do, right? So there's real world consequences for certain people, but with academia, there really are no consequences, right? And so it's a little dangerous when you let academics decide all of your policy. And what's more important than peer review, like we have this worship in academia of peer-reviewed studies. Like if you have a circle jerk of a whole bunch of sycophantic people who all grew up through the same filtration system where they're all programmed to think exactly alike and they all have the same professors, that somehow that's going to validate information in a way that's reliable. Well, what I believe is more important is getting your boots on the ground. And that brings me to something that I honestly never thought that I would have to say, in that I love what the LA Times did today. Who would have thought this, man? I pointed out I dump on the LA Times constantly, but this is an outstanding article by Noah Haggerty. You love to see a California bureaucrat sharing this. My question is, why are they not sufficiently acting on it? Now, what am I talking about? I am talking about Wade Crowfoot. Wade Crowfoot, who is, what is he, the head of natural resources? Yeah, natural resources secretary in California. By all measures, I'm not sure what he's done. So there is something interesting about him tweeting this out, but I like that he's tweeting this out. Now, this is behind a paywall, and Lord knows I'm not going to pay for the LA Times. I like what this was. Let me see if I can get this to pop up for you guys. This was the article by Noah Haggerty. And what he's talking about, and the headline is a little bit, it's a little bit of a sucker punch, right? It says, to solve the wildfire crisis, we have to let the myth of the wild die. Now, I think for most people, when they read this, it's like instantly triggering. Like, oh, here we go. We're going to be lectured by Team Plant. Team Plant is going to lecture Team Human again on how terrible we are. It's going to be this bleeding heart, misanthropic gobbledygook, right? I was pleasantly surprised by Noah's work. And one of the things, basically what this hinges on, is this perception that when Teddy Roosevelt was preserving these lands with John Muir, and they talked about the preservation of these priceless remnants of America's wilderness. Now, immediately, we're going to have this knee-jerk reflex like, how dare you come for TR, our greatest president, the greatest man who ever ran this country. How dare you? And we always talk about how the national parks and our national forests, like that's the greatest achievement of the United States, at least domestically, right? Here's the thing. What he's coming after is this perception of what the wilderness is and looks like, right? This comes back to that clip that I played from Hotshot at the front of the stream. We have this perception that the European invaders in North America, somehow we inherited this natural landscape untouched by man and these beautiful sequoias that TR was marveling over and wanted to preserve. That somehow that was the wilderness. That is not the wilderness. We've talked about this before. There's 3 distinct eras of forest management, especially out west, right? You have the natural era, which is the pre-human era. Okay, everyone conflates the Native American era with the natural era because we think, oh, they were so natural, they didn't have computers, so it's totally natural, right? No, they were very heavy-handed with how they manipulated their environment. And I don't think people appreciate just how heavy-handed they were. The imprint of man on this landscape is everywhere. And frankly, those giant sequoias, like General Sherman, they only exist because of the heavy hand of the Native Americans who lived and tended these lands for thousands of years. They did not have a hands-off approach. It wasn't just nature doing its thing. Far from it. So this article gets into that, and I really dig it. And the cool thing is, I've said this a lot, you cannot sufficiently write about the subject of wildfire unless you actually get out in the wildlands. And too many reporters at the LA Times and obviously the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're not actually out in this stuff. Every once in a while, maybe they'll show up next to the red truck squirting down a burning structure, but they are not in it. They are tweeting from, their urban flat somewhere. And everything they learn is just in that academia circle jerk where they are unperturbed by the realities of field work and being on the ground. Okay. And this is very obvious whenever you read their reporting. But what I loved about this is that he talks about how the indigenous people here actually had a very heavy hand. They had a heavy hand here, and they were constantly burning the area, and fire suppression completely upended that. Now, I pulled out some highlights that I really wanted to touch on. I didn't want to share the whole article. Where can we find this? Where'd it go? Doggone it. Let me find this because I pulled just a few lines that I thought were really good here. And I'm glad that he's conveying this to the readership of the LA Times because normally all they're getting is these misanthropic polemics about climate change. He says open forests where previously light could reach down to the ground became dense, shadowy thickets. Many areas of the forest are now 5 to 6 times denser than they were before European settlement. Now, if you saw that clip at the front end of the live stream, that scene from my film, you can see why I gravitate towards someone sharing this. We have no idea what a healthy forest actually is supposed to look like. It is a lot leaner. And I showed you that image, that transition of the Bear Creek Ranger Station almost 100 years apart, and just how dense it's become. And I'm always like screaming from the rooftops, guys, this is why the fires are getting so big. What's frustrating is that, when it comes to the debate on is climate change doing this stuff or is it fire suppression, here's the problem. How do we separate the two? How do we separate the fire effects of overgrowth and fire suppression and climate change? Because the factors that contribute to both of these things have been ramping up at basically the exact same scale and pace and timeline. So a century of fire suppression leading to bigger, more destructive fires, that dynamic of you've been holding the beach ball underwater for a long time, and the more you push it down, the more explosively it comes back out. The results of that are kind of they're gonna look like the climate is changing and it's going up that hockey stick graph, right? And so it's very difficult in public circles, especially where academia is already biased towards the climate change narrative. It's very difficult to get them to differentiate and identify that maybe it's the overgrowth of the fuels. We are going to destroy this, and the Garnet Fire is going to destroy this as well, this myth. One of the other points, according to virtually all of the ecologists, fire scientists, and indigenous fire practitioners I've spoken with over the last year, this myth created our growing wildfire crisis in California. To solve this crisis, they told me the myth must die. And that myth is this perception of the wilderness. Like we got to be hands off. That is not the way to do it. And the natives certainly were not hands off. They were very hands on. So I love that Noah Haggerty is conveying these messages to the readership of the LA Times, because this is a stark contrast to what they typically get, this commie gobbledygook that they're always pushing that creates this learned helplessness, which is all the climate narrative does. I don't even care to debate how much climate is impacting wildfires. We know it has an impact. My whole point is it's not relevant because you're not going to change it. And so the more you dwell on that, the more you're dwelling on something that removes our agency from dealing with this stuff. So I don't like it. Now, onto this experimental fire that's going to validate this article, and it's going to disprove all of the myths in mainstream media about what's creating the problem with wildfires. We have the Garnet Fire. Garnet? Kevin Garnett? This fire, I pointed this out early this morning. And I've noticed a whole bunch of people are now suddenly talking about the tea kettle experimental forest. Like we all knew about it. But I'm glad that people are talking about it. Now, this area is very interesting. Some of you may not know what the tea kettle experimental forest is. It's a very old experiment area, as the name might imply. And what they've done is for almost 100 years now, they've created this section of the forest at a mid to high elevation where they basically cantoned off certain like a mosaic patchwork of different areas where they could test different principles of forest management, specifically thinning and the effects of removing trees. And they're trying to mimic fire effects by physically removing trees. They're also applying prescribed fire. Now, I want to give you guys just like a little summary of what this place is. So the Tea Kettle experimental area is located 80 kilometers east of Fresno. Whenever I see kilometers, that always reminds me of the scene in Inglourious Bastards when Germans, they say three like this, and the British guy posing as a German says three like that. It's these subtle little indicators that you're dealing with a communist. Someone like Phil Cunningham would say 80 kilometers east of Fresno, California. Give me a break. This is America. We don't do kilometers. The Tea Kettle experimental area is located 80 kilometers east of Fresno, California, between Yosemite and Kings Canyon National Parks. Site ranges from 2,000 to 2,800 meters in elevation and is old-growth forest consisting primarily of mixed conifer red fir forest. This forest type is common on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. The dominant species include white fir, red fir, sugar pine, Jeffrey pine, incense cedar. God, I love incense cedar. Whenever fires burned through incense cedar, like the Bobcat fire did in 2020, there were times when I would just sit down and watch the fire and just smell it because it smells so good. And no homes were burning, so it wasn't a catastrophe. It was just a nice experience in nature. And I'm telling you, if you can ever go to an incense cedar fire, by all means do it. So, like, genuinely, it's like a life-changing experience. And California black oak. Mixed conifer forests in the southern Sierra Nevada are frequent fire forests. Historically, these forests experience frequent, low, and mixed severity fires. Frequent fire, okay? It's going to be a theme here. A survey of fire scars at Tea Kettle found that the mean historic fire return interval for the site was 12 to 17 years. Prior to the first prescribed burn in the fall of 2001, the forest had last experienced fire in 1865. Now, I told you yesterday that that increased smoke production or column production from the Garnet Fire yesterday that everyone was freaking out about, even though it only grew like 3,500 acres. It was because it emerged from the rough fire scar, was now entering an area that doesn't have fire history. So prior to them putting prescribed fire on the ground in this area, it had not seen fire since 1865 in an area that should be getting fire every 12 to 17 years. Okay? That is a long, long time. That is a massive fire debt. Now, what is the consequence of that? I want to show you. This is the consequence of not having fire for 100 years, 150 years. This was from California Wildfire Track. If you're wondering why the Garnet Fire is getting so huge, here's a part of the reason. The Sierra National Forest is a mess. This is what the unburned portion looks like. No fire history in the last 100 years. Drought and bark beetle have also plagued this area, creating a mess of dead fuel. Now, if you recall from the clip from Hot Shot that we played earlier, I talked about how fire debt is actually worse than drought because it creates drought even when there isn't one. And this is a concept that I've received pushback on. But here's the issue. Think about any garden, right? Think about a garden. Let's say you've got 5 plants and they each need 1 gallon of water. Okay, so you've got 5 gallons of water, you've got 5 plants. What would be worse? If you were to knock over 2 of your 5 bottles of water and you lost 40% of your water, that would be a drought, right? You lost 40% of your water, that'd be a drought. What's worse? Losing 40% of your water or allowing double the amount of plants? Now, if you watch that clip at the beginning of the stream, you know the answer. Well, it's worse to have double the amount of plants. If you double the amount of plants, then you've effectively cut your water supply in half because you've increased the water demand. And we're going to get into this. We already have results from the Tea Kettle experimental forest that are going to validate this. Okay, so this might be a little bit of a dunking episode for me. So anyway, back to the summary of the site location and the description of the Tea Kettle experimental forest. The climate here is typical of the Sierra Nevada region with hot, dry summers and mild, moist winters. Most of the annual precipitation falls as snow between November and May. From 2012 to 2016, the state of California experienced a severe drought, resulting in widespread mortality across the Sierra Nevada. Now, when it comes to drought, Phil Cunningham says it's called water stress. Correct. There are 2 ways to get water stress. You have a depletion of your precipitation, or you have an increase in the amount of water demand, right? There's 2 ways to get that. The issue is California gets drought historically. There have been 200-year-long droughts in California history, okay? Like there was a drought that lasted for 200 years. It is a place of extremes. We know this, okay? So everybody is always panicking all the time about the sort of whipsaw nature of the state, but that is just, that is what it is. You get extremes in California. A lot of times you'll get ripping wildfires that are destroying everything in its path until snow falls on it, right? It happens on the Cave Fire in 2019. So the issue is when you do get that inevitable drought, how well prepared are you, right? It's sort of like any other kind of debt. It's like any other kind of debt. If you're making a ton of money and you've got a whole bunch of expenses, you got that expensive fancy car, you have every premium subscription, you're going to the fancy gym, you have all these things, heavy property tax on your killer mansion. What happens when all of a sudden the work goes away or COVID shuts down everything, right? I should say government shuts down everything. COVID didn't shut down anything. What happens when suddenly you have a drought in your income, but you have all of these obligations? You're screwed. You're going to collapse. If you don't have a lot of obligations, well, then you can weather that storm or the lack thereof. And it's the same with the forest. So when you have a lot of water competition, then when you do get that inevitable drought, what happens with bark beetles, for example? Everyone will talk about, oh, the bark beetle infestation due to climate change. We have a bark beetle infestation. The way that the media talks about the bark beetle infestation, which certainly led to wildfire severity, because you have a whole bunch of standing dead trees with holes in them. So you have these like oxygenating holes. So trees were just going up like crazy all throughout California. But here's the thing, the way that the bark beetles are always there. They're always there. They're omnipresent, just like the cold virus. You only get sick when your immune system gets really depleted. This is why we tend to get sick during cold season in the winter. It's not that the cold virus is suddenly spreading around. What it is that you have a lack of vitamin D, you're less healthy, you have a weaker immune system. And so that cold virus that's omnipresent suddenly has the upper hand, right? That's how it works. Well, it's the same with the bark beetle. So normally the tree's defense against a coring bark beetle is its viscous sap. That sap is going to push that thing out. It's going to seal up the hole, or it might even trap the bug in there. But when a tree is water stressed, when it's dry, it does not have that viscous sap. And so the coring beetles just go all the way through, and then they'll kill the tree. Okay? Again, there's two ways to get that. There's with drought, and then there's with an overgrown forest. How do we get an overgrown forest? Fire debt. Now, what are some of the results? Let me show you what this area looks like. I'm going to show you the tea kettle experimental forest. So this is a PDF. This is from the U.S. Forest Service. I cannot tell you how many of these I went through when I was researching for Hot Shot. So like, I'm not just like flying off the cuff when I make claims in this film. Like I really did try to validate this stuff as much as I can. And now here's the premise of the tea kettle experiment. It's fire and thinning effects on mixed conifer ecosystems. So I thought some of this stuff is really fascinating. And this is a product from the early 2000s. And so you're going to notice something. I want to go through a few pages of this, and I want to see if you guys noticed the same thing that I did. Introduction, like much of the Western United States, Sierra Nevada forests have been significantly changed by a century of logging and fire suppression. Prescribed fire and mechanical thinning are widely used for restoring forest health, but how do their ecological effects differ? The tea kettle experiment was initiated in response to this question. The experiment is an interdisciplinary collaboration of more than a dozen scientists working in coordination to investigate the effects of fire and thinning treatments. Now, this is the legacy of fire suppression. You'll notice this is a lot like that clip that I played at the front of the show. Look at the difference in density in this forest between the 1890s and the 1970s. So roughly a century. I think that the pictures that I showed in the film are even more dramatic than this. They're way more dramatic than this. But you still get the point. Notice the difference. Now, a century of fire suppression has fundamentally changed the Sierra Nevada forests. Historically, mixed conifer fire intervals was 12 to 15 years for low-intensity underburns, but it is now estimated to be over 600 years. That's crazy. That is a crazy amount of fire debt. Tree density has dramatically increased. Species composition is dominated by thin bark, fire-sensitive fir, and incense cedar. Historically, fire was a significant influence on plant establishment, growth, and mortality. But what drives these processes now? Now, it shows the history of logging. This is kind of stark, man. When I saw this map, man, like I know we need logging, we need wood, we need timber. This is how we built our society. But at the same time, it's like, man, look at that change in density. That's kind of crazy. That's crazy. Restoration issues and concerns. Small and intermediate-sized trees can ladder. Surface or ground burns into catastrophic crown fires. We all understand ladder fuels, right? Litter accumulation can produce hot, long-duration temperatures that can kill large, old trees. 3, much of fire suppression regeneration is small and of marginal economic value. They're talking about all these saplings. These saplings. Now, anyone who's ever tried to start a campfire, a bonfire, knows that you can't just put some big chunks of firewood in there or some round logs and then put a lighter underneath it. You need to have some grass, right? That's what you'd start your fire. And then you need like thinner chunks, like kind of splinters of wood, and then maybe slightly bigger sticks. And then on top of that, you can have the bigger chunks of firewood. If you don't have that ladder of thinner fuels, you're never going to get that stuff to light. Here's the mission and goals. Because of these restoration roadblocks, some forests may require mechanical thinning before prescribed fire is applied. Meaning we have let this problem go on for so long that if we just let fire enter into these areas that are totally overgrown, you can get devastating crown fires, because what we're dealing with right now is a reckoning of 100 years of suppressing this stuff. So now we have to mechanically thin the forest. And whenever you see Gavin Newsom talking about treating, right? When you ask them about prescribed fire, they always talk about treating. Most of their treatments are mechanical thinning, which is the most expensive way of doing any of this work. It's the most expensive way. We're talking like $3,000, $4,000 an acre. It's absolutely unmanageable, yet that is their preference all the time. It's like they prefer to do thinning. Now, we might be tempted to think, because this is what they're telling us, that thinning can be equated with prescribed fire. This experiment, which again, this is old stuff. This is old stuff. So this has long been known. This experiment is going to prove that thinning does not come close to doing what prescribed fire does. The tea kettle experiment was designed to examine how thinning and fire differ in their effects on mixed conifer ecosystems. Specifically, the experiment grew out of a key question raised in the Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project. Although silvicultural treatments can mimic the effects of fire on structural patterns of woody vegetation, virtually no data exist on the ability to mimic ecological functions of natural fire. We know that these ecosystems are fire dependent, right? A lot of these trees require fire in order for their cones to release the seeds and to germinate. Okay, so you cannot deprive a forest of fire. It's like depriving it of water. Daniel Firecopter says, I am the honorable man. I don't know, man. But dude, I wonder if this title is going to stick now. Am I now the honorable man on fire? Cunning Phil Cunningham says, Gabriel actually really does know what he's talking about. That's because I actually literally read 2 of Cunning Phil Cunningham's studies in my research for Hotshot, because one of his studies about counter-rotating vortex pairs was vital in my understanding of the fatality incident on the El Dorado fire. So the only reason I know what I'm talking about is because people like Phil and the people who are running these kinds of experimental forest areas with the Forest Service have done this work, right? And I get to scoop it up and try to convey it in a way that's, maybe digestible to, low IQ individuals like myself. And if I can do that, then it sounds like I know what I'm talking about. But as you'll notice, I feel like I repeat myself a lot because a lot of this stuff is actually, it's pretty remedial stuff, right? Once you understand the main concept, it all seems to follow. Let's go on to some of the results. Now, they broke up their component studies. And they weren't just studying the fire effects on the vegetation, but also the soil, the atmosphere. They're studying the watershed because this is extremely important, right? Now, the way that they set up this experiment was they essentially had 6. Let me see if I can just pull it up so you can have a visual on this as well. They had 18. This is the area, by the way. Okay, this is the area, and it's 6,200 feet in elevation. See. God bless it. We're back to Imperial. Thank God. All of this stuff is cool. All of this is cool. Here's their sampling design. So they essentially had 18 plots, right? And 6 treatment types. So they were replicating these 6 treatment types 3 times. And what they had was overstory thinning, understory thinning, and then nothing. That's their baseline. And then they had those 3 things plus fire. Okay, so they had no mechanical thinning with just prescribed fire, overstory thinning with prescribed fire, and understory thinning with prescribed fire. So 6 different treatment types, 3 times scattered in this mosaic. So that way, they're not just getting a bias where it's like, oh, well, the control was all in the drainage. You know what I mean? Because that's going to skew the results. They were trying to mix this mosaic. Now, here are some of the results, because this is a pretty long document. Here, these are the 6 treatment types here. That's their little grid. So I just pulled out some of the key findings here, just so we can kind of fast track this. I found this really interesting. Thinning without burning significantly increases litter and slash cover, severely reducing herb, as Phil would say, diversity and cover. Burning increases herb diversity and cover and reduces competing shrub cover. The fall burn had little impact on plants or litter in unthinned plots because without additional slash, fire extent and intensity was very limited. This is super important, by the way. In my film, we talked about the Peshtigo fire. Some people like to tell me it's the Peshtigo fire. That's how the modern Wisconsins will refer to it, but the natives pronounced it Peshtigo. So the Peshtigo fire in 1871 was far and away the worst fire in human history. We've, at least, in recorded human history. We had thousands of people got vaporized in that fire. It burned 1 million acres in a matter of a few hours. It had like 120 mile per hour winds pushing it because of the cold front. And there are stories from that fire where it burned so hot that train cars fused to the tracks. People who had to flee into the Peshtigo River either boiled alive, or if they made it out of the fire area, they froze to death in the water. It was a catastrophic fire. And one of the main reasons it was so bad, aside from obviously it was very dry, you had a cold front pushing dry, gnarly winds through the area, there was a ton of slash, right? So a lot of logging activity, you had a bunch of slash piles everywhere. You have a lot of this throughout California. And this finding here validates the problem with thinning and with logging. That slash is really, really problematic. So if you are just doing thinning, this is a huge vulnerability. And this is one of the things that Governor Newsom is never going to tell you about, right? The prevailing treatment that they do is mechanical thinning. It's this, which is going to leave a ton of slash that's going to make you even more vulnerable, potentially. Fire consumed snags and logs on steeper slopes. Surviving logs and snags were highly clustered in low intensity or unburned microsites. This is important actually for things like the flying squirrel. They will nest in these snags. So you do need some of them in order to have our cool little flying squirrels around. In our cool fall fire, large tree mortality was low and usually only resulted from burning logs against the tree bole rather than from litter mounds. Okay, stick with me. It's going to get more interesting. Here are some of the main conclusions from their study. And the reason why we're talking about this is because the Garnet Fire is now pushing through this area. Now, they've managed to find out a lot of interesting stuff just from I think they established this in 1938. So we're pushing close to 100 years of running experiments in this forest. They already have a ton of really cool findings. But now we have a wildfire that's pushing through it. So we can see a real world experiment of like, how are these plots going to do? Remember, we covered that one study where the antelope fire burned through a similar experimental forest area up in Northern California. And they were able to see that, the different treatments had a really, really significant impact on the intensity of the fire. So now here are the main conclusions. What are the primary influences on ecosystem function in mixed conifer forests? Water, largely determined by snowpack depth, soil depth, and percentage organic matter. Temperature is also a strong but secondary influence. Soil nitrogen has little effect. After thinning, slash and litter can retard diversity and some ecosystem processes. Dude, you got to be careful if you're doing this thinning work. In the absence of fire, what drives tree regeneration and mortality? Canopy cover, climate, and pests. In the absence of fire, climate and pests become dominant factors in regulating the forest. So if we're concerned about climate change, again, I'm going to keep going over this point over and over and over again. I don't care to debate the impact of climate change. I care to debate the relevance of it. And in the absence of fire, climate becomes relevant. So if you are worried about the impacts of climate on your forest, fire is the answer. Regeneration is influenced by overstory canopy cover, and El Nino. Mortality is driven by drought and pests. And remember, drought and water stress can come from two things. Water stress is produced by high stem densities from fire suppression and periodic La Nina events. Can I take a bow at this point? Do you guys think I just made this shit up in my movie? I'm going to read this again. Water stress is produced. What's the first thing they cite? High stem densities from fire suppression. That is where the water stress is coming from in our forests, not climate change. We have always had droughts in California. The idea that Western forests don't know how to survive periodic droughts from these periodic La Nina events is dumb. This drought stress predisposes trees and pests/pathogens, particularly beetles, are the final agent. At Tea Kettle, wind was not significant. What did we just talk about? This water stress, which is primarily from overgrowth. This is what leaves trees vulnerable to the bark beetles. They didn't just swoop in 10, 15 years ago like some plague of locusts. It's not how this stuff happens. We are dealing with a reckoning of depriving the forest of fire, which is a necessary component of a healthy forest. Number 3, what are some of the key functions of large trees and pieces of coarse woody debris? Large logs do not act at moisture reservoirs, nutrient sources, or seedling nurseries, and are fairly ephemeral, less than 60 years. Large snags are used by flying squirrels and cavity nesting birds. Fire consumes most logs, although some large snags are not completely consumed or are able to entirely escape burning. How does thinning affect fire intensity and extent? Off-season, outside of July and September. Interesting how they define off-season as anything outside of July and September. I'm always saying how fire is seasonal. And everyone's like, well, they'll point to an anomalous fire like the Thomas Fire in December or the Palisades or Eaton Fire in January, where you had like a Rube Goldberg series of unfortunate events that led to those fires. That doesn't change the seasonality of fire season, okay? It's July through September predominantly, especially in this area. Prescribed fire may have reduced intensity and extent without thinning slash. In unthinned plots, the prescribed fire did not carry, and where it did burn, there was little consumption. Thinning increased fire intensity, but the extent was patchy in places of concentrated skid trails. Now, they also found that skid trails were effective in reducing fire activity. How does thinning differ from fire in its effect on ecosystem function and succession? Thinning alone, even when designed to mimic fire, i.e. the CASPO with no burn, it's that the California spotted owl protocols. So they can't thin within like 50 feet of a spotted owl nest. That's what CASPO is. Thinning alone, even when designed to mimic fire, appears to stall some processes such as nutrient cycling, plant succession, and decomposition and respiration, possibly because of the increase in slash and litter. So thinning in and of itself is not effective. Now, it's good for right around your home for structure protection, but out for the forest, out for forest health, it's no good. And it's disrupting a lot of natural processes that are fostered by fire. Overstory thinning, like a crown fire, has the potential to significantly change microclimate and forest structure, further reducing the number of large trees already thinned by pest mortality. This is why you have to get rid of these ladder fuels. This is why you have to get rid of the ladder fuels, because when you get a crown fire, it's devastating. And that is going to rewrite an entire forest. Moderate thinning may beneficially increase off-season fire intensity. Okay? Fire was the most important process for restoring ecosystem health. Is that definitive enough for you? Our research suggests thinning prescriptions should be designed to serve fire. Designed to serve fire. How many times am I saying this? You cannot just do the thinning work. You have to follow it up with fire. Our research suggests thinning prescriptions should be designed to serve fire. like a bitch by 1, separating crown from surface fuels, 2, distributing slash to increase the extent of the surface burn, and 3, removing large fuels such as logs from leaf tree boles. This is really definitive. Okay. Thanks for sticking with me on that, because I know this can be kind of obnoxious. So I apologize, guys, but like I think this is so important. If we care about what's going on with wildfires here, we got to pay attention to this stuff. There is no replacing fire. There's no replacing it. Okay. And the majority of the treatment work that Gavin Newsom's always bragging about is thinning. Okay. You need fire to move through these landscapes. Now, speaking of having too much growth, I had Goyo send me this. This is in Santa Barbara. This is in Santa Barbara. So this is Schofield Park. Look at how decadent this is. What's been interesting since I've been, calling attention to the overgrowth around Topanga State Park, more and more people have been sending me their own images of, their hiking area. People are starting to take note of the overgrowth, and they're realizing and recognizing what a potential danger this is for their community. I'm glad that people are really paying attention. I think it's time for I got to do another flame shame episode. I'm going to be in a unique place tomorrow. I may do an in-person flame shame episode for you guys. I may not be able to do it live because I have to meet with some very important people. Not that you guys aren't important, but none of you guys are going to pay my mortgage unless you guys start sending me a bunch of tips immediately. I may not be able to do it live, but I'm going to do a little flame shame episode. Now, I want to show you guys where this is at. This is Schofield Park. It's above Santa Barbara. I think it's right through here. Now, this area burned in the T fire. Over here to the east, this burned in the Thomas fire, and I think it even extended through here. We actually have pretty good fire history. I want to take a look at this. Yeah. So let's go back a few years, and Thomas fire, and what is that? Jesusita fire. So that's a big chunk. You got to go back to 2008, I believe, is when this area burned. The T fire burned through the Schofield Park area. So that's 2008. So it's coming on 20 years, and you can see it looks like it's kind of ripe for another fire. And the T fire was pretty devastating. I've talked about how Santa Barbara is kind of vulnerable, but if you zoom out, they have a pretty good amount of these puzzle pieces filled in. There are a few areas where it could slip through. And frankly, this area of the T fire it's been around long enough. There's been enough regrowth and tons of rain in the interim that it's actually good to go. Right? I think a fire history from 2008 is too long ago. I think looking back from 2015 on is probably more kosher. It's more kosher. So here you only have the Thomas fire and you've got the Cave fire offering protection. But I think there's still some areas with pretty decadent brush. So I think Santa Barbara needs to be on watch because you get some pretty nasty downslope winds, some offshore winds, and it's lights out. The good thing is I think people around here are actually pretty well suited to receive fire. Let's just do a quick little drop in, see what we see. This is an elevated, all right, there's a ton of palm trees and cypress trees. I don't like that. That's not necessarily good. But, I don't know. Some of this stuff, like you got a lot of succulents, you got a lot of agave. There's kind of a mix here. Guys, you got to get rid of these palm trees though. This is the stuff that scares me. Like this ratty ass palm tree up here, this thing's just going to be showering your home with embers. You got to be careful. So I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about this neighborhood. They've got a lot of stucco, metal roof. I like the spacing of this garden. I think this is fine. A lot of this stuff for the most part is decent and seems mostly well manicured, but the palm trees got to go, guys. They got to go. So, this area might have some challenges when fire moves through here, especially if it comes busting up that hill, right? If you're on top of that slope, that's something you got to worry about. So I would be slightly concerned about fire pushing through here, just because we've seen some nasty fires. The T fire was really, really bad. And that was started by some reckless teenagers. So, be on guard. Now, the one fire that we aren't talking about, Ken is talking about because it's near his pad. This is the Blue Fire, way up in Northern California, way up there. Now, it's relatively small. I think it's only like 400 and something acres right now. And so that may be part of the reason why we're not talking about it. But keep your eyes on the Blue Fire and keep your eyes on the Dillon Fire. They're very close to each other up near like Soames Bar. We've got a big heat wave coming in to Oregon and the entire Pacific Northwest and extending down into, of course, that bleeds into Northern California. It could be concerning. I've warned about how Septembers can be pretty bad in the Pacific Northwest, and it looks like that might be shaping up. Oregon has actually been having some pretty gnarly fires. We only ever talk about California fires, but Oregon's been getting hit. Like the Emigrant Fire is burning pretty good. Watch Duty says the Blue Fire is 49 acres right now. Blue Fire was last mapped at 49 acres. Okay, that's good. All right, that's not so bad. Keep an eye on these, though. Fires are stubborn in this area. So even if it's 49 acres, don't let your guard down. This is very, 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 very steep terrain. Okay. Anyone who's ever gone to any fires up near Happy Camp in this area, the ironically named Happy Camp, it is the least happy camp on the planet. It is brutal up there and pretty decadent fuels. So you can get fires that get really stubborn. And when you get a thermal belt, push these things into a drainage, there's kind of no stopping it. So keep your eye on the Blue Fire. It might get sporty. It might not. Like I said, the main theme of this fire season so far is not so bad. That's been basically every fire so far in this season. I'm not talking about January. So just keep your eyes on NorCal. There's still some holdover ignitions that we haven't discovered yet. And this incoming heat event, which is apparently going to be quite significant. Like we might get some record temperatures. Could be bad. And we could maybe finally see a little fire siege up north and some of these holdovers expose themselves. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me on that. Read that LA Times article by Noah Haggerty. It's definitely worth it. I like it. And you know me, I never want to give props to the LA Times ever because they're so frustrating and most of their wildfire reporters are so disappointing. But Noah has clearly spent a lot of time out in the wildlands, and he understands this. And in this article, it does not teeter into that sort of bleeding heart, misanthropic, self-loathing bullshit. There's no climate non sequiturs. It's a very focused and precise article. And it talks about all the things that we discussed in this tea kettle experiment, right? We know the answers. We've known the answers forever, right? Long before all of these foresters from Yale University came in and fucked up everything for the last 100 years. What we're dealing with right now is a reckoning. It is a reckoning. And unfortunately, it's not going to get better until we get fire on the ground. You saw in that tea kettle study, fire is the most important process for restoring ecosystem health. This is not me, douchebag with a mustache who's just a filmmaker saying this. This is the U.S. Forest Service. It's been studying in this tea kettle experimental forest since 1938. Okay? I think this is pretty well established. All right? Fire is nature's cleaning crew. And our ecosystem depends upon it. Okay, so we need to be reintroducing this stuff. We gotta stop putting out all these fires all the time. Daniel Firecopter says there's some gaps for the Dillon Fire to slip through. Looking at recent history, Casey K was saying it looks like Dillon has a lot more fire history around it. Blue looks like not much fire history. These are the vulnerabilities. Again, the smartest firefighters I ever was around. Whenever you'd ask them, "Hey, what do you think is going to happen this year? What do you think is going to happen this season? What's it looking like? We've got a drought. We've got a bunch of heat waves. We didn't have that much rain in the off season. And so I was always hoping that they would tell me, like, oh, it's going to be a big year. I don't think it's going to be so bad. They never said that. All the smart firefighters, you know what they'd say? We'll see. There's so much wisdom in that. We'll see. Are these fires going to explode? Yeah, we'll see. Don't make predictions, guys. It's the easiest way to look like an ass, right? Don't make predictions. The ingredients are there, and like I've said, things can kind of turn a corner pretty quickly. And like I've said over the last 5 days, I think there are still a bunch of ignitions out there that have not revealed themselves yet, and they're waiting to exploit some kind of weather event, and that weather event may be coming. Okay, so just keep your eyes peeled. Don't relax. If you live in the wildland urban interface, make sure you are ready to receive fire. Okay, because it may be coming. It's most likely coming in October. So just be ready for it. All right, guys. I'll try to feed you guys some cool stuff from where I'm going tomorrow. It's a special place, but I may not be able to do it live. Which you know what? Maybe that means I'm going to become AI. Because in this dystopian world of AI, the only way to prove you're human is to do it live.